Forget the chocolate. Forget the luxury watches. Forget the pristine ski resorts in St. Moritz. Those are just the glossy brochures. The real export of this tiny, landlocked nation is something entirely invisible, yet it dictates the financial gravity of the entire planet. Their primary product is absolute, weaponized financial invisibility for the global elite. Right now, you are living in a system where every cent you earn is tracked, taxed, and scrutinized. If you transfer $600 on Venmo to pay for a shared vacation or a used couch, the IRS or your local tax authority wants a piece of it. You are subjected to aggressive audits, confusing tax brackets, and a constant underlying anxiety that you might have made a math error that will cost you your savings. You play by the rules because you have to. You fund the roads you drive on, the schools your children attend, and the electrical grid that powers your home. You carry the crushing weight of your nation's infrastructure on your back. But there is a completely different set of rules for the people at the top, and those rules are written in the valleys of the Alps. While you are budgeting for next week's groceries, billionaires, corporate titans, and political oligarchs are legally evaporating entire GDPs into Switzerland. They do not see this country as a quaint European democracy. To the ultra-wealthy, Switzerland is a geopolitical panic room. Let's look at the raw, undeniable math. Switzerland has a population of roughly 8.7 million people. That is smaller than the population of London or New York City. Yet this tiny fraction of humanity sits on top of nearly $2.5 trillion of foreign offshore money. They control roughly 25% of all global cross-border private wealth. 1 out of every $4 that crosses an international border seeking a place to hide ends up in a Swiss vault. How did this happen? For decades, the global public has been sold a masterful PR campaign. We are taught in history classes that Switzerland remained neutral during the devastating global conflicts of the 20th century. We are told they are a peaceful people who simply refuse to take sides. But in the ruthless world of macroeconomics, neutrality is not a virtue. It is a calculated, monopolistic service. When nations tear each other apart through economic sanctions, trade wars, and physical destruction, capital panics. Money is a coward. At the first sign of instability, wealth flees the borders of collapsing economies and seeks a safe harbor. By officially refusing to take sides, Switzerland positioned itself as the ultimate, untouchable escrow agent for the world's most dangerous money. They realized early on that if you don't judge where the money comes from, you get to hold all of it. They profit from every side of a geopolitical crisis without ever having to face the consequences. When an emerging market faces hyperinflation, the local elite don't suffer. They have already converted their local currency into Swiss francs, safely parked in Geneva. When a government collapses, the state treasury often mysteriously vanishes, only to reappear as a series of digital zeros in a Zurich server farm. This is the ultimate wealth transfer, and it directly impacts your wallet. Every time $1 billion is successfully hidden in a Swiss account, that is $1 billion removed from a tax base. It is $1 billion that is not building hospitals, repairing bridges, or funding pensions. The deficit doesn't just disappear. The government still needs that money to keep the lights on. So who makes up the difference? You do. Through creeping inflation, higher property taxes, and a shrinking standard of living. You are actively subsidizing the financial invisibility of the 0.01%. They built an economic fortress disguised as a peaceful republic. But how did a landlocked country with almost zero natural resources build an impenetrable vault that even the IRS and the European Central Bank couldn't crack? The answer lies in a single, terrifying piece of paper signed in 1934 that made transparency a literal crime. 2. The 1934 Secrecy Act, criminalizing truth. To understand how a modern nation engineered the greatest financial vanishing act in human history, We have to look at the architecture of the system. The foundation of this invisible empire wasn't built on gold. It was built on a legal paradox. In 1934, the Swiss government passed the Federal Act on Banks and Savings Banks. On the surface, it sounded like a boring piece of financial regulation. In reality, it was a declaration of financial independence from the rest of the world's laws. The 1934 Act introduced Article 47. This specific clause did something unprecedented. It made giving up a rich man's financial secrets a state crime. It didn't just offer privacy, it legally obligated Swiss bankers to lie to foreign governments. If an auditor from the United States, the UK, or France knocked on the door of a Zurich bank and asked if a specific corporate raider was hiding taxable assets there, the banker wasn't just allowed to refuse. If they told the truth, they would go to prison. This was the birth of the legendary numbered account. You didn't need a name, you didn't need a face, you were just a cryptographic key. The bank itself barely knew who you were. Only a tiny handful of elite managing partners held the master ledger connecting the number to the human. We need to destroy the myth that offshore banking is a victimless, white-collar game. It is not a victimless crime. It is a direct, mathematical extraction of wealth from your local community. Imagine a corrupt official in a developing nation who signs a contract granting a foreign company the rights to the country's copper mines. The official receives a massive kickback. If that money stays in the local economy, it gets tracked. It leaves a paper trail. But if it goes to a numbered account in Geneva, the trail goes dead immediately. The wealth of an entire nation's natural resources is siphoned out, leaving the local population in crushing poverty, while the capital sits sterile and safe in the Alps. This exact same mechanism is used by Western corporations and billionaires. When wealth leaves your country's taxable perimeter, the state's budget experiences a massive shortfall. The math is brutal and undeniable. The government has a fixed cost to maintain society. If the top 1% removes their capital from the equation using Swiss secrecy, the remaining 99% must cover the gap. Have you noticed your local taxes going up while city services and roads get worse? Hit subscribe because we're about to show you exactly where that missing money went. The 1934 law effectively criminalized the truth. It created a black hole in the center of the global economy where gravity simply stopped working. For decades, whistleblowers who tried to expose the tax evasion happening inside these institutions were treated not as heroes, but as traitors to the Swiss state. They were hunted down, prosecuted, and jailed. The system was designed to protect the capital at the expense of human morality. And the sheer volume of assets under management, the AUM, became staggering. The size of the Swiss banking sector swelled to multiple times the size of the country's actual, physical GDP. They were managing the world's money, and in return, they skimmed off the top. They charged exorbitant management fees for the privilege of silence. This influx of capital made the Swiss franc one of the strongest currencies on earth, enriching the local population and creating an incredibly high standard of living, completely insulated from the economic devastation happening in other parts of the world. They built a utopian society funded by the evasion of others. They became the quiet custodians of the world's greed. They didn't have to invent a new software, they didn't have to manufacture cars, and they didn't have to drill for oil. They just had to keep their mouths shut by law. But hiding stolen wealth is just the beginning. What happens when the Swiss decide to use that dark money to control the very food you eat and the gas you put in your car? Welcome to the Black Box. Part 3. The Commodities Black Box, the Invisible Toll. When you drive to work on a Tuesday morning and notice the price of fuel has jumped another 40 cents overnight, what do? You probably grip the steering wheel a little tighter. You calculate how much less you can spend on groceries this weekend. You might blame the president, the current administration, or a distant geopolitical conflict you saw on the news. When the cost of a basic loaf of bread or a pound of ground beef slowly climbs out of reach, forcing you to downgrade your family's dinner, the talking heads on television will give you a very polite, sanitized excuse. They will look into the camera and talk about supply chain bottlenecks, transitory inflation, and natural market corrections. They are lying to you by omission. They are describing the symptoms while completely ignoring the parasite. To understand why your cost of living is suffocating you, you must look at the physical mechanics of the planet. Look at the copper wiring inside the smartphone in your hand. Look at the aluminum in the frame of your car. Look at the crude oil powering the cargo ships bringing your electronics across the Pacific, and the grain feeding the livestock in your local supermarket. Now ask yourself a geographic question. How many oil derricks operate in the Swiss Alps? How many massive open-pit copper mines are carved into the sides of the Matterhorn? How millions of acres of industrial wheat are harvested outside of Zurich? The answer is 0. Switzerland has virtually no natural resources of its own. It is a small, rocky, landlocked fortress. Yet against all logic, physical geography, and common sense, the companies based in this tiny nation control roughly 20% of the entire global commodities trade. Through an opaque network of private corporations with names you have likely never heard, Glencore, Trafigura, Vitol, Mercuria, Switzerland acts as the ultimate, unavoidable toll booth for human survival. These are not companies that pull oil from the ground or grow food in the dirt. They are the middlemen. They operate the commodities black box, and their business model is beautifully brutal. They control the space between the desperate country that produces the resource and the desperate consumer who needs it to survive. Let's break down the illusion of organic inflation. Sometimes prices at your local store aren't skyrocketing because there is a genuine shortage of wheat or oil. Often there is plenty of supply on the planet. The price is going up because a commodity trader sitting in a soundproof, climate-controlled office in Geneva just engineered a squeeze. These Swiss-based trading houses don't just push paper. They own the physical infrastructure of global trade. They own the fleets of supertankers, the deep-water ports, the massive storage tanks, and the hidden warehouses. When global panic strikes, whether it's a regional conflict, a pandemic, or a blocked shipping canal, these traders do not panic. They salivate. They use their vast logistics networks to hoard physical resources. They will legally park a fleet of oil supertankers just offshore, refusing to sell the crude oil into the market, intentionally creating a localized shortage. They wait while the prices tick higher and higher on the global exchanges. They wait while your local gas station owner is forced to raise prices just to break even. And only when the price reaches maximum pain, when the market is screaming for relief, do they release the supply. The difference between what they paid for that oil in the shadows and what you paid for it at the pump is known as arbitrage. It is entirely legal, and it generates hundreds of billions of dollars in pure revenue. While you are deciding whether you can afford to turn on your air conditioning this summer, a 28-year-old trader in Zug is securing a $50 million cash bonus for successfully bottlenecking a critical energy supply chain. They operate entirely in the dark. Because these trading giants are largely privately held partnerships, they do not have to open their books to the public. They do not hold quarterly earnings calls where journalists can ask uncomfortable questions. They broker deals with sanctioned regimes, warlords, and heavily indebted developing nations, trading hard currency for exclusive rights to national resources. They funnel the raw materials of the earth through the Swiss legal shield, ensuring the profits remain largely untaxed and entirely invisible. You are paying an invisible premium on every single physical good you consume. Every time you buy food, energy, or technology, a tiny fraction of that transaction is silently siphoned away, flowing upstream into a Swiss bank account. It is a brutal, mathematical transfer of wealth from the global working class to a handful of untouchable intermediaries. Part 4. The SNB Hedge Fund, Printing Fiat, Buying America. To truly grasp the scale of the financial manipulation happening inside the Swiss borders, we have to look past the private banks and the shadow traders. We have to look directly at the sovereign state. We have to look at the Swiss National Bank, or the SNB. If you took an Economics 101 class in college, you were taught a very specific, very boring definition of a central bank. You were told that central banks are conservative, slow-moving institutions designed to stabilize a nation's economy. The Federal Reserve in the United States manages interest rates to keep inflation in check and unemployment low. The European Central Bank does the same for the Eurozone. Traditionally, central banks hold their reserves in extremely safe, boring assets, gold bullion, and government bonds. But the Swiss National Bank threw that textbook out the window. They mutated. They evolved from a traditional monetary authority into the largest, most aggressive, legally sanctioned rogue hedge fund on the planet. And they used this mutation to quietly execute one of the most audacious wealth transfers in modern financial history. Let's look at the mechanism of this currency fortress. Because Switzerland is viewed as the ultimate safe haven, whenever there is panic in the global markets, billionaires and institutions frantically buy Swiss francs to hide their wealth. This massive influx of demand causes the value of the Swiss franc to skyrocket. Now, for a regular country, a super strong currency is a disaster. It means your exports, like heavy machinery, pharmaceuticals, or luxury watches, become incredibly expensive for foreigners to buy. A soaring franc threatened to hollow out the actual, physical Swiss domestic economy. So the SNB had to intervene. They had to artificially weaken their own currency to protect their exporters. How do you weaken a currency? You dilute the pool. You print more of it. This is where the macroeconomic cheat code was activated. The SNB engaged in a radical, aggressive form of quantitative easing. They literally pushed a button on a computer in Zurich and created hundreds of billions of Swiss francs out of absolute thin air. This is fiat currency in its purest, most raw form. Money created by decree, backed by nothing but the authority of the state. But what the SNB did next is what separates them from every other central bank on earth. Instead of using this freshly hallucinated money to buy domestic bonds or build Swiss infrastructure, they took this fabricated wealth, traded it on the open market for US dollars and euros, and went on a massive, unprecedented shopping spree. They didn't buy foreign government debt. They bought equities. They bought the stock market. Take a moment to process the sheer audacity of this math. You have an American worker, perhaps a nurse in Ohio, or a construction worker in Texas. Every 2 weeks, a small percentage of their paycheck is automatically deducted and placed into a 401k retirement account. That worker is hoping that over 30 years, their tiny slice of American corporate giants, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, will grow enough to allow them to retire with dignity. They are investing hard-earned, heavily taxed capital generated by physical labor. The Swiss National Bank was competing against that worker. But the SNB wasn't using saved capital. They were using infinite, freshly printed fiat. If you look at the mandatory SEC 13F filings, the documents that large investment firms must submit to the US government disclosing their holdings, the SNB's portfolio is terrifying. At its peak, the Swiss National Bank's balance sheet ballooned to over $800 billion. A massive percentage of that was held in foreign equities. They became one of the largest single public shareholders of American technology giants. This is not a neutral economic policy. This is wealth extraction. When an American consumer buys a new iPhone, or a small business pays for a Microsoft Cloud subscription, they are generating revenue for those corporations. Those corporations then pay out dividends to their shareholders. Because the Swiss National Bank used infinite, created money to buy massive blocks of those shares, they are legally absorbing those dividends. The wealth generated by American innovation, paid for by American consumers, is systematically siphoned out of the United States and funneled directly into the vaults of the SNB. They are harvesting the retirement growth of the global middle class. They are inflating asset prices, making it harder for average citizens to buy into the market, while capturing the quarterly profits for themselves. It is a perfect, closed-loop machine. They print money that didn't exist yesterday, use it to buy real, tangible slices of the most profitable companies on Earth, and use the returns to subsidize the pristine, untroubled utopian society inside their borders. The base erosion parasite, corporate tax havens. To understand this legalized heist, you need to look closely at the device you are likely using to watch this video. Whether it is a smartphone manufactured by a tech giant or a laptop running an operating system built by a global monopoly, that piece of hardware represents a massive, invisible financial vacuum. When you walk into a retail store in your hometown, whether you live in Ohio, Manchester, or Munich, and you purchase a $1,200 device, you naturally assume that the profit from that sale is taxed in the country where the transaction took place. You assume the system is fair. You assume that because you pay a heavy income tax to live and work in your country, the multinational corporations extracting billions of dollars from your local economy are doing the same. This is the greatest lie of modern corporate capitalism. The reality is that trillion-dollar monopolies have weaponized a macroeconomic strategy known as base erosion and profit shifting. In the boardrooms of the global elite, they call it be peace, but you can just call it what it is, a parasitic drain on the middle class. And the epicenter of this parasite is located in sleepy, picturesque Swiss jurisdictions like the Canton of Vaud and the Canton of Zug. Here is exactly how the mathematical illusion works. Let's say a massive American tech company sells billions of dollars worth of software in the United States and Europe. On paper, they are generating massive domestic revenue. But right before the tax authorities arrive to collect their share, the corporation activates a trapdoor. Years ago, this tech company transferred the legal ownership of its intellectual property, the patents, the brand logo, the source code, the underlying algorithms, to a tiny shell subsidiary legally registered in a Swiss canton. This Swiss subsidiary doesn't manufacture anything. It doesn't have massive warehouses. It might consist of nothing more than a brass plaque on a door, a registered mailbox, and a few highly paid corporate lawyers. Yet this empty shell owns the ideas that power the entire global empire. So at the end of the fiscal year, the Swiss subsidiary sends a massive bill to the American or European branches. They charge exorbitant, artificially inflated licensing fees for the right to use their own company's logo and software. The domestic branches pay these billions in fees, wiping out all of their profit on paper. Because they officially show zero profit, they pay zero corporate taxes to your government. Where did all that money go? It's shifted seamlessly into the Canton of Zug, where local tax rates for foreign corporate profits are aggressively negotiated down to a microscopic fraction of a percent. The money is washed, saved, and added to the corporate treasury completely legally. This is where the global becomes brutally local. This is where the macroeconomic data strikes your wallet. When a multinational giant evades billions in domestic taxes, the cost of running your country does not decrease. The government still needs to pave the highways. The state still needs to fund the military, maintain the electrical grid, and pay the teachers in your local district. Because the trillion-dollar monopolies have opted out of the system using Swiss loopholes, the state must find that missing capital somewhere else. They find it in your paycheck. You are forced to make up the difference. You subsidize their unprecedented profit margins through higher property taxes, creeping local sales taxes, and the silent, crushing weight of inflation when the central bank is forced to print more fiat currency to cover the sovereign deficit. Every time a corporate giant dodges their tax burden by shifting intellectual property to the Alps, you become measurably poorer. We are taught to idolize these corporate titans. Financial media praises their brilliant management, their streamlined operations, and their unmatched efficiency. We need to destroy this myth right now. It is not brilliant business management. It is not technological superiority. It is legalized tax evasion masquerading as financial genius. They hire armies of elite accountants and lawyers not to innovate, but to obfuscate. What percentage of your income vanishes to taxes every single month? Drop that number in the comments right now. Then compare it to the fraction of a percent paid by the trillion-dollar tech monopolies we just mentioned. For nearly a century, this system seemed invincible. A fortress of absolute secrecy, infinite fiat money, and tax evasion. Until one weekend, the arrogance finally caught up with them, and a 167-year-old titan vanished overnight. Part 6. The cracks in the vault. The Credit Suisse collapse. For generations, the global elite believed the Swiss financial vault was a law of physics. Unbreakable, immutable, immune to the chaotic boom and bust cycles that devastated the rest of the planet. And the crowning jewel of this invincible system was Credit Suisse. Founded in 1856, this was not just a regional bank, it was a foundational pillar of global capitalism. This institution funded the creation of the Swiss railway network. It survived 2 world wars, navigated the Great Depression, and sailed through the 2008 global financial crisis, while American banks were hemorrhaging to death. It was the trusted custodian for the darkest, most lucrative wealth on earth. But hubris always exacts a vicious toll, and the collapse of Credit Suisse was not an accident. It was a slow-motion financial autopsy, revealing a toxic culture of unregulated greed that ultimately ate itself alive. The cracks in the vault actually began to form years earlier. The arrogance of the Swiss banking sector finally provoked the one entity on earth with the power to break them: the United States Department of Justice. Tired of watching billions in taxable American wealth vanish into numbered accounts, the U.S. government forced the implementation of FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. The era of absolute, impenetrable secrecy was violently pierced. Swiss bankers were arrested. Multi-billion-dollar fines were levied. The world realized that the Swiss legal shield could, in fact, be broken by brute geopolitical force. But instead of pivoting to safety, the executives at Credit Suisse doubled down on extreme risk. Stripped of their ability to rely solely on the guaranteed profits of tax evasion, they transformed their investment banking arm into a casino. They engaged in spectacular, systemic failures of risk management. They chased yield into the arms of toxic shadow entities. They lost billions in the catastrophic implosion of Archegos Capital Management, a highly leveraged family office that was essentially gambling with the bank's money. They entangled themselves deeply with Greensill Capital, a disgraced supply chain finance firm. Every time a high-risk financial contagion broke out anywhere on the globe, Credit Suisse was somehow standing at ground zero, holding the bag. They abandoned the legendary Swiss precision for blind, desperate greed. And then came the weekend of March 2023. The system finally broke. Following the collapse of regional banks in the United States, a wave of pure, unadulterated terror swept through the global elite. They looked at Credit Suisse, a bank weakened by scandals, massive quarterly losses, and an exodus of executive talent, and they panicked. What happened next was the first truly digital bank run of the modern macroeconomic era. The ultra-wealthy did not line up outside branches in Zurich in the rain. They tapped the glass screens of their smartphones from penthouses in London, yachts in Monaco, and private jets over the Atlantic. They initiated massive wire transfers, draining billions of dollars of liquidity out of Credit Suisse every single minute. The speed of the capital flight was mathematically impossible to survive. In a matter of 48 hours, a 167-year-old financial leviathan, an institution managing over $1 trillion in assets, a bank woven into the very fabric of the global economy, functionally evaporated. The Swiss government, terrified of a sovereign collapse and a total loss of faith in their national brand, stepped in. They orchestrated a ruthless, emergency shotgun wedding, forcing their only other massive bank, UBS, to absorb the toxic remains of Credit Suisse. They bypassed their own shareholder laws to force the deal through. They threw a $100 billion liquidity lifeline at the problem, entirely funded by the implicit backing of the Swiss taxpayer. The elite socialized their catastrophic losses, forcing the public to underwrite their reckless gambling. This is the ultimate warning sign for your own financial reality. We must destroy the myth of too big to fail. When systemic panic hits the markets, even the legendary Swiss precision shatters into dust. If an ancient, foundational titan managing the wealth of billionaires can be erased in a single weekend because of toxic assets and algorithmic terror, how safe do you truly believe the money is in your local neighborhood branch? What protects the bank holding your mortgage, your checking account, and your business loans from the exact same digital contagion? Nothing. The system is a fragile house of cards built on blind faith and fiat promises. The Swiss vault has been cracked, but the trillions hidden inside are already looking for a new dark corner. And next time the music stops, the collapse might just take your local bank down with it.